On September 5th, 1912, a 22-year-old woman named Ellen Greesh woke up in the middle of the night to find two black men inside her bedroom. Supposedly, they were scared off by Ellen's mother. Local authorities went out to Big Creek, where the break-in had supposedly happened. Ellen then accused two black men, Tony Howell and Isaiah Perkle, of attempting to rape her. Both were just immediately jailed, and they awaited their trial. Meanwhile, a black man named Grant Smith spoke out against the accusations. Grant was a prominent black minister in the area, and supposedly he mentioned to the authorities that at least one of the accused men had been in consenting relationship with Ellen. That didn't sit well with the local white community. So the locals soon found Grant and dragged him into the town square, where they whipped him with horsewhips until he nearly died from his injuries. Sheriff Bill Reed intervened just in time to save his life and get him to safety in the courthouse. After the near fatal beating of the minister, it's not clear what happened in the case of Ellen Greesh. 3 more black men were accused of being accomplices, but no one was arrested for the assault and near lynching of Grant Smith. He was kept in the courthouse and eventually transferred out of the city for his own safety.
At the time, it was a pretty common stereotype in the South that black men sexually assaulted white women. Terrible stereotype. So the white townsfolk would often lynch them to protect what they called white womanhood, whatever that means. But in reality, a lot of these women were just having affairs, or they were just in relationships with black men. And a lot of them just didn't want to deal with social backlash of infidelity or an interracial relationship. So they would just blatantly lie. Like in the case of Ellen, maybe her mother just came into the bedroom, found them with a black man. She was like, what is he doing in here? But nobody likes that idea at the time. And so it riled up all the white folk. And many of these accusations just cost these black men their lives, unfortunately.
Just a week after the case of Ellen Greesh, in September 1912, a young white woman was found in the nearby woods within an inch of her life. Passerbys found her beaten, bloodied, and unconscious. She was a young white woman, 18-year-old Sleety Mae Crow, and on September 9th, she had been walking from her home to her aunt's house nearby on Brownsbridge Road. It was near the Forsyth Hall County line. Supposedly, her attacker had pulled up a small dogwood tree by its roots, snuck up behind her, and struck her over the head. She was then dragged deeper into the woods, raped, and struck at least 3 more times over the head with a large stone, crushing her skull. She then fell into a coma for 2 weeks and eventually died. The rape and the murder led to the arrest of 4 black people. Authorities arrested Rob Edwards, his wife Jane Daniel, and her 18-year-old brother Oscar Daniel, as well as a 16-year-old boy named Ernest Knox. Rob Edwards, also known as Big Rob, was supposedly seen near the scene of the crime around the time it occurred, and that's all the evidence that they had on him. He was just nearby, and while he sat in his cell, he was seized by an angry mob. The deputy, Gay Lummis, found out that the local sheriff had organized the abduction of Big Rob from prison. The deputy then tried his best to stop them, but it was no use. The mob had grown into dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of angry white people. Supposedly 2,000 people stormed the jailhouse. They took Big Rob to the town square and beat him with crowbars, and then shot him to death. They then wrapped a rope around his neck and dragged him around the town square before stringing his body up on the arm of a telephone pole, and several white spectators then shot bullets into his lifeless body. Hundreds of the townspeople joined in, and there is no record of any indictments or prosecutions for the lynching crimes. As for the 16-year-old Ernest and 18-year-old Oscar, their trials for the rape and murder of Sleety Mae Crow lasted only 1 hour. The only piece of evidence in Ernest's case was a small pocket mirror of his that was supposedly found near the crime scene. A few days before, they put him through a mock lynching where they pretended to hang him. This scared Ernest so much that he confessed on the spot to try and avoid the gallows. Both trials happened on the same day with juries of 12 white farmers, and both were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were hanged just outside the city. The hanging area was later described as a county fair. There was a huge celebration, and between 5,000 and 8,000 people came out to celebrate and watch the execution.
So keep in mind that public executions weren't even legal in Forsyth County at the time. But the judge, Newt Morris, ordered a 15-foot high fence to be built around the gallows, so it technically wasn't a public execution. But the night before the hanging, a group of white men burned down the fence, and of course they left the gallows intact. So the city,
because they wanted it like publicly viewable.
Exactly. So the city was just like, hey, we did what we could to make it not public, when they really didn't. It was just a technicality and a loophole. People even took souvenirs from the gallows after the fact, which is disturbing, right? They took pieces of the noose, and one piece is even still preserved in court records, and it's actually placed next to Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel's names.
Oh, wow.
So now it acts as kind of an artifact of our disturbing history,
right.
But at then it was like someone just wanted this,
possession. Wow.
Exactly. Plus, the judge, Newt Morris, would later lead a lynch mob in Atlanta just a few years after this. The mob murdered a man named Leo Frank. So you can kind of get the picture of the systemic racism that's built into this system that they had there. And, it's going all the way to the top with the judge.
After the attack on Sleety Mae Crow, the local papers began spreading rumors of a potential black insurrection. The papers claimed there had been a spree of sexual assaults committed by black men, and they wanted to rile up the white townspeople. Rumors also spread that the black community conspired to dynamite white people's homes. So on the night after Sleety's funeral, a group of angry white men gathered in town. They would soon get the nickname the Night Riders. They gathered on horses and planned on punishing the entire black community in Oscarville. Technically, the KKK had been defunct since the 1870s, about 4 decades earlier, but its angry racist roots were still strong in the American South. These night riders lit their torches and burned down the black churches and homes across Oscarville. Attacking churches was a way to break the social and spiritual community. They also shot bullets into their cabin windows. But many of the black people didn't even own the properties they lived in. Many were sharecroppers' cabins, and they stayed here while they were indebted to the white farm owners. Around the same time as these attacks just across the Chattahoochee River in Hall County, similar acts of white terrorism were also growing. But the major difference between the Hall County and the Forsyth County night ride was that the Hall County men were arrested. Their names were listed in the local papers the next day, and they were tried for their crimes. Meanwhile, in Forsyth, none of the night riders were prosecuted, and local law enforcement didn't give a shit. And Sleety Mae Crow's family was in full support of the violence. They were even quoted calling the local black people the fiends of hell. The riders then drove more families out of their homes, shot their dogs and livestock, and burned their furniture and belongings. So in 1912, almost every black resident of the town was forcibly relocated. Over several months, the night riders exiled 98% of the black people in town, which was roughly 1,100 people. This was about 10% of the entire town at the time. The few black families that stayed behind were the ones who worked for wealthy property owners in the nearby town of Cumming. During the attacks, a white woman named Ruth Jordan joined her father to go check on their black neighbors, the Cook family. They found the house empty and their furniture was shot to pieces. When they called out to the Cook family, they emerged quietly from the nearby woods. They had spent the night there hiding in terror. This is what many families had to do while all of their possessions were destroyed, and they soon fled the area with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Here's actually a clip of a relative of Oscarville residents passing on the story this terrible time.
Night riders came through. They had to leave everything. The main thing they left was property, and my grandfather had 100 acres. So when they got to the Chattahoochee River, from what I understand, they were told when the mob got up on the bridge, they were told that they either had to swim or drown. Most of them didn't make it. My grandfather, one of them that did make it, he lost some brothers and sisters. From what my mother told me, buried all of them. He would sit and tell her this story, and he would just sit and cry.
100 acres. His grandfather owned 100 acres.
They just had to abandon it.
In one of the most prosperous black towns in the U.S., and yet they're just
driven out.
Yeah.
And by the end of October 1912, all the night riders had to do was leave a bundle of sticks at a black family's front door, and that family would be gone by morning. The homes that weren't burned were left abandoned, and later seized by the government for the owners not paying taxes, or their titles were illegally stolen by white landowners over the years. And for the next several decades, Forsyth County remained all white. After the racial cleansing of 1912, many of the white property owners went on to prosper in the region. They became so successful that Oscarville was one of the few farming communities that survived the Great Depression and the boll weevil attacks on cotton. But as the years passed, the state government began looking at the town as a possible water supply location for the Atlanta metro area. Almost everyone in town, except for 5 families, were asked to sell their land to the government. Roughly 700 families from 3 different counties sold a total of 56,000 acres to the U.S. government. And in 1947, the Chamber of Commerce and the Industrial Bureau struck a deal to construct the Buford Dam, which took 4 years to complete. Once they finished it, they filled in the lake for the first time in 1959. Locals jammed the nearby roads and bridges to watch the water swallow up the land. Its water would eventually supply 6 million people with fresh water. It would soon become known as Georgia's Inland Ocean, and they named the lake after the Georgia poet Sidney Lanier, who was also dubbed the Poet of the Confederacy. What was once Oscarville was fully submerged beneath the surface and mostly forgotten. This town only lived on through old maps, archived newspaper articles, and oral history. The Forsyth County newspaper had been established in 1908, but for some reason, all of its records before 1917 are completely missing. Probably not by accident. And much of Oscarville's history wasn't even remembered until the 1980s. A civil rights march in 1987 became one of the first public moments that the tragedy in Forsyth County was addressed in modern times. Before the introduction of the lake, many of the remains of Oscarville had been removed by the Army Corps of Engineers before the valley was filled, but the traces of buildings and fence posts and other lost relics remain. Debris from the roads and bridges still cover the lake floor. Most of the trees from the surrounding forest were cut down to the stumps, but some of the submerged trees still stand 70 feet from the bottom. All of these hazards have become a problem for swimmers and boaters, especially during seasons of drought. Still, many use Lake Lanier as a vacation spot to relax and unwind, especially during the summer months. 11 to 14 million people a year visit the lake and take their chances. It now currently has 625 billion gallons of water, almost a million Olympic-sized swimming pools, and it stretches 38,000 acres with plenty of places to boat and camp along the shores. Its deepest point is 200 feet right near the Beaufort Dam.
Light out, everybody.